how do we truly understand the history of music? I mean, is it really just a curated collection of famous names and the works we hear about endlessly, pieces that have been canonized and celebrated over centuries?
Mhm.
Or is there, like, beneath that familiar surface, a vast hidden landscape? Forgotten composers, obscure works, unique sounds just waiting to be rediscovered if only we knew how to look or maybe listen differently.
That's a really profound question, actually, and it gets right to the heart of what we're digging into today. Our common perception of music history, well, it's often much narrower than the immense reality.
Right.
It's been shaped by particular narratives, and these inevitably privilege certain figures, specific traditions, even certain places, leaving, frankly, a wealth of musical activity, largely in the shadows.
Exactly, and that's precisely what we're diving into. Today we're embarking on a deep exploration of how our understanding of music history is actually constructed and perceived. We're going to look at both the traditional approaches, which as you say are often narrative-driven, focusing on specific stories and figures.
The sort of greatest hits version.
Yeah, the highlight reel. But then we'll pivot to the incredibly powerful and I think revealing insights that emerge when we apply rigorous statistical methods to historical musical data.
The quantitative side.
Precisely. It's a journey that will show you how this quantitative lens can challenge long-held beliefs, reveal subtle, often invisible biases, and even bring previously overlooked figures, especially pioneering female Baroque composers, back into the spotlight.
Our deep dive today is guided by two really compelling sources that offer a remarkable kind of dual perspective. First, we have this comprehensive PhD thesis. It's titled Statistics in Historical Musicology by Andrew Gustar.
Yeah.
And this work meticulously details the application of quantitative methods to vast musical data sets. It's quite something.
Sounds intensive.
It is. And second, we have another insightful study, this one focusing on the style, analysis, and performance practices of selected choral works by Isabella Leonarda.
Ah, so specific focus there.
Exactly. This second source provides a vivid human counterpoint, highlighting the lives and challenges of real composers whose stories might otherwise, well, remain unheard.
So our mission for you, our listener, is to demonstrate how a blend of quantitative rigor, the objective power of data and nuanced historical understanding, the human stories, the cultural contexts, can offer a more complete, more objective, and I think deeply human picture of musical activity throughout the ages.
It's about seeing the whole forest, not just the most prominent trees that always catch the eye.
Perfectly put. So let's begin to unpack this complex and utterly fascinating topic.
Where should we start? Maybe with how musicology has traditionally operated.
Good idea. Let's talk about those traditional blind spots.
Okay, so what's truly fascinating here is how traditional historical musicology has largely relied on qualitative methods. Now, qualitative research is incredibly valuable, don't get me wrong. It offers deep insights into individual cases, specific events, unique artistic expressions.
Sure, the deep dives into specific pieces or lives.
Exactly. But historically, when applied to music, this approach often focused almost exclusively on what was perceived as, well, the great works, great individuals, great events, and great institutions of Western music. Gustar points this out quite clearly in his thesis. It gives us a very particular, often quite curated view of history.
Right, emphasizing the exceptional rather than the typical.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit further then. This intense focus on the greats, whether it was a conscious decision or maybe not, often operates under what some scholars have termed a subconscious great man hypothesis.
The great man idea.
Yeah. Imagine it like turning music history into a kind of high-stakes competition where only a handful of winners are celebrated and remembered. It inadvertently creates this invisible hierarchy of winners and losers.
That's a good way to put it, an invisible hierarchy.
It's almost as if we've been reading only the highlight reel of a sporting event, missing the vast majority of the plays, the unsung heroes, maybe even the existence of other leagues entirely. We get a very narrow, albeit impressive, slice of the entire musical pie.
That analogy of a highlight reel is spot on. And to illustrate this, think about a concrete example.
Oh.
Many Western music history books published before, say, the 1980s.
Okay.
If you pick one up, you'd be genuinely hard-pressed to find much, if any, mention of female composers.
Oh.
Take Manfred Buchholzer's highly influential 1947 book, Music in the Baroque Era. Foundational text for generations of music students, right?
Absolutely, a classic.
In that extensive work, he only briefly notes Francesca Caccini as a virtuoso singer. And then, with what seems like a casual dismissal, he characterizes her operas as simply inferior to Monteverdi.
Wow, just like that.
Just like that. This isn't just an oversight, it's a clear value judgment. It reinforces a particular narrative and really demonstrates the subjective nature of these qualitative approaches when they lack a broader, perhaps more objective, framework.
And that's where the real problem lies, isn't it? This over-reliance on qualitative methods, as Gustar articulates, can actually lead researchers to disbelieve or discount things they have not seen, despite evidence to the contrary.
It's a confirmation bias, almost.
Exactly. So if the existing established narrative doesn't include something perhaps because historically it was written by men, for men, about men it's easily overlooked or downplayed or even actively ignored. This inadvertently reinforces those existing narratives and biases. It creates a kind of self-perpetuating cycle where the familiar becomes the only thing we look for and the unfamiliar remains perpetually hidden. It's like a historical echo chamber.
A historical echo chamber, I like that. And this profound methodological bias, this great man hypothesis, brings us directly to the specific and often, frankly, insurmountable challenges faced by female composers throughout history.
Yeah.
This is where understanding these biases becomes not just academic, but absolutely crucial to rediscovering a fuller, richer past.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly quite revealing. When you delve into the societal restrictions, particularly for women in, say, 17th century Italy, you see just how deeply ingrained these biases ran.
It was systemic.
Totally systemic. Women were largely and systematically excluded from the mainstream professional music world. They simply couldn't secure the coveted, often lucrative positions in churches or royal courts, public theaters, schools, private households of the elite, or even within city administrations.
Major patrons.
Right. The Roman Catholic Church, for instance, which was a massive patron of the arts, primarily and almost exclusively employed male musicians. This wasn't just a minor disadvantage. It was a structural exclusion that funneled women's musical aspirations into very specific, very limited channels.
Indeed, and the very idea of a woman mentally manipulating or creating complex music was often seen as inherently contradictory to the prevailing societal views of femininity at the time.
That seems incredible now.
It does. But even as recently as 25 years ago, scholars like Lucy Green were articulating how the idea of a woman mentally manipulating or controlling music is incommensurable and unacceptable because it clashed so fundamentally with traditional views of women's perceived dependent bodily femininity.
Wow, so the expectation was purely physical or emotional expression, not intellectual creation.
Largely, yes. This pervasive cultural belief acted as a profound, invisible barrier, making it incredibly difficult for female composers to be recognized, to get published, or even to be seriously considered as intellectual artists on par with men.
So despite these enormous, almost suffocating obstacles, a surprising and incredibly vital space emerged for women's music making. The convents.
Ah, yes, the convents. Crucial.
In 17th century Italy, these religious institutions became incredibly dynamic and vital centers for music. They offered a unique sanctuary, providing a space for girls' musical education and training that was simply unavailable elsewhere.
They became hubs.
Exactly. Convents became one of the very few avenues for women to engage publicly with music, cultivate their talents, and even pursue composition. You could almost think of them as a kind of hidden conservatory system, fostering an entire, often overlooked, musical ecosystem.
However, this wasn't without its own significant challenges and paradoxes. The Council of Trent, back in the mid-1500s, had attempted to reform convents and strictly restrict nuns' musical activities. They even threatened their contact with external, often male, teachers and musicians.
Trying to shut it down.
Trying to control it, certainly. But, and this is key to understanding the lived reality, the enforcement of these decrees varied dramatically depending on the local church authorities.
Ah, local differences.
Huge differences. For instance, the archbishops in Siena sometimes actively encouraged nuns' music, perhaps recognizing its spiritual value or, let's be honest, even its public appeal.
Really? Public appeal?
Oh, yes. There's a fascinating historical anecdote from 1671 where apparently all Siena came and stayed right through Vespers at Il Refugio, captivated by the nuns' performances.
Wow, so they were drawing crowds.
They were. This illustrates the complex, often contradictory interplay between overarching religious doctrine and the flexible, adaptable local practices that sometimes allowed for surprising musical freedom.
And it wasn't just Siena that offered these pockets of musical vitality, right? You mentioned Milan earlier.
That's right. In Milan, Archbishop Federico Borromeo, who served from 1595 to 1631, actively encouraged nuns' music in his diocese. He personally delivered scores and even instruments to convents.
He delivered them himself.
Apparently so. And remarkably, he approved the performance of Italian madrigals, but with Latin texts substituted.
Yeah, a compromise. Secular form, sacred words.
Precisely. Which confirms that even secular musical styles, albeit with a religious veneer, were being performed in Milanese convents. And there's even speculation some nuns might have used the rouleau, that rotating cylinder in the wall for passing packages.
Yeah, the turntable thing.
Exactly. They might have used that to discreetly access new secular music trends from the outside world.
Ingenious. That highlights a surprising degree of cultural connection and artistic agency even within these enclosed walls.
It really does. It shows us that even within strict confines, human ingenuity and the passion for music, well, they find a way. These varying local attitudes and the resourceful adaptation by nuns themselves beautifully illustrate the resilience and creative ingenuity within these female communities. They managed to foster a vibrant musical life against tremendous odds.
These broader societal constraints and these conventual opportunities directly shape the lives of individual composers like Isabella Leonarda and Maria Xaveria Peruchona, who we're focusing on from our second source.
Two fascinating figures from the same convent, actually.
Right. Isabella Leonarda, born in 1620, lived until 1704. She was an Ursuline composer from the Collegio di Sant'Orsola in Novara, Italy, and she was remarkably prolific. She managed to publish an impressive 20 volumes of music, primarily sacred works.
20 volumes, that's substantial output by any measure.
It really is. Her compositional style, while consistent and expertly crafted, was more characterized by refinement and adherence to established forms rather than, say, radical innovation. She clearly mastered the musical language of her time.
Then, in stark contrast, we have Maria Xaveria Peruchona. She passed away in 1717, also an Ursuline from the very same collegio.
Same place, same order.
Yes. But she published only one single volume of music during her entire lifetime.
Just one. Why the difference?
Well, historical records suggest that her convent's choir was relatively small, perhaps numbering just 6 strong singers around the time she was most active.
Limited resources.
Exactly. This limited ensemble likely constrained her ability to create complex, multi-part polyphonic works, which might have contributed to her apparent loss of interest in composition over time. That's a poignant insight, isn't it? Even within the same institution, individual circumstances, like the available performing forces, could profoundly impact a composer's output and legacy.
That makes perfect sense. And the Ursuline lifestyle itself offers a crucial clue here, too, right? Initially, they weren't as strictly cloistered.
That's correct. Initially, Ursuline nuns were not strictly cloistered. They didn't take solemn vows in the same way, and some could even live with their families for periods. This relative flexibility in their enclosure made their communities incredibly attractive.
So they drew recruits.
They drew daughters from prominent noble and bourgeois families, many of whom possessed significant musical talent and education already. This influx of resources and talent also allowed the Collegio di Sant'Orsola to become an important economic center within Novara, which further supported and sustained its musical endeavors.
So when we look at these personal histories, particularly that striking contrast between Leonarda's 20 volumes and Peruchona's single one, what does this all mean for our broader understanding of music history?
Well, I think these individual stories demonstrate just how deeply that great man narrative, or perhaps just the general focus on greatness, impacted which musical contributions were preserved, published, and ultimately remembered.
Right.
It highlights that the absence of a composer from the historical record often says less about their talent or productivity, and much more about the systemic barriers and biases of their time, and frankly, of the historical process itself.
Which underscores the critical need for new methods, like the statistical ones we're going to talk about, to rediscover these silenced voices and recognize the vast unseen musical activity that truly existed.
Absolutely. It's about finding tools to look beyond the established narrative.
Okay, so let's pivot now. Let's talk about unpacking music history using the power of quantitative methods. What do statistics actually bring to musicology?
Right. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, statistics offer an incredibly powerful alternative lens to view music history. They let us move beyond just isolated anecdotes and purely subjective interpretations.
Getting away from just stories.
Exactly. As Gustar compellingly argues in his thesis, quantitative methods allow us to quantify and contextualize existing information in ways that qualitative analysis simply cannot, or at least not easily on a large scale. They provide, and I love this phrase from his work, a collective voice to the many minor and obscure works and composers that have historically formed the vast majority of musical activity, but who have been largely absent from the received history of music.
That's huge. It's like giving a voice to the musical silent majority, democratizing music history, as you said earlier.
Precisely. It's about seeing the base of the pyramid, not just the very peak.
And that's a crucial distinction you're making, because while qualitative research gives us that deep, rich insight into individual cases like Leonarda or Peruchona, it often falls short in revealing those broad patterns, the macro-level trends, or clear cause and effect relationships over vast stretches of time.
You get a beautiful, detailed portrait of a single tree, but you might miss the immense interconnected forest entirely. Gustar clearly highlights this limitation. He emphasizes the need for tools that can, well, paint with a broader brush.
So quantitative methods, by analyzing large data sets, they can provide these broad spatial and temporal patterns. Like what specifically?
Well, for instance, they can show us migration trends of composers across continents over centuries, or the evolution of musical characteristics like key usage or harmonic complexity across thousands and thousands of scores.
Okay.
And perhaps more importantly, and this is a key takeaway from Gustar's research, quantitative evidence is usually less elitist and more representative than our qualitative data. It doesn't get automatically drawn into the narrative of the exceptional. Instead, it allows us to see the typical and all its diversity.
Right.
It gives a voice to the hundreds of thousands of forgotten composers and their works that constituted the everyday musical landscape, rather than just the handful that ended up in the history books.
And it's not just about what we miss when we rely solely on qualitative narratives. It's also about the biases we might unknowingly carry or perpetuate, right?
Absolutely. Every data set, every archive, every historical narrative, and indeed every historian carries implicit biases from its compilers, conscious or unconscious.
Sure, we all have them.
Statistics help us not just identify these biases, but crucially, to quantify them. This leads to a more precise assessment of the confidence we can place in our conclusions. It's like having a scientific way to double-check our own assumptions, and the assumptions baked into the historical record itself.
So it adds a layer of objectivity, or at least awareness of subjectivity.
Yes, by quantifying these biases, musicologists can avoid what Gustar calls false, questionable, unfounded, or exaggerated claims that might otherwise slip through unchallenged. He cites the McDonald case study, for example.
What's that?
It starkly demonstrated how purely qualitative research, if it's unchecked by rigorous quantitative evidence, can lead to spurious conclusions. In that specific instance, a qualitative assertion about changing musical characteristics in a certain period was shown to be statistically incorrect once actual analysis was applied to a large data set.
Ah, so the data didn't back up the story.
Exactly. It forces a level of accountability and empirical rigor that I think ultimately strengthens the entire field of musicology.
Okay, now that we've talked about the why of quantitative methods, let's get into the really juicy stuff. Let's delve into some fascinating, so specific examples from Gustar's statistical research that really bring this power to life. These are the kinds of surprising insights that can really change how you think about music history.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start with a study on composer movements. This case study analyzed the biographical data of a substantial number of composers, 666 to be precise.
Okay, a decent sample size.
A very decent sample. And it revealed some truly surprising patterns in their migration. For instance, it showed that a significant portion, roughly 1 in 7 composers, actually spent their entire lives very close to their birthplace, stayed put.
Really? Only 1 in 7. I might have guessed more stayed home.
Well, maybe less mobility than we sometimes assume for artists. But for those who did move, their first relocation typically occurred at a remarkably young age, an average of just 22 years old.
22? That's young. Suggests education or that first big break.
Exactly. Early career opportunities or educational pursuits seem to be powerful drivers of mobility.
And it gets even more interesting, statistically speaking.
Oh, yes. The study looked at the overall pattern of their moves across their lifetimes and found it approximated what's known in statistics as a Poisson process.
Okay, Poisson process. Put that down for us a bit.
Sure. Basically, a Poisson process describes events occurring at a constant average rate over time, independently of when the last event occurred. Think of it like the number of emails arriving in your inbox per hour, or maybe cars passing a point on a highway. It's random, but there's an average rate.
Got it. So for composers.
In this context, it suggested an average rate of 1 move every 14 years. for composers throughout their careers. Now, this isn't a rigid schedule, obviously, but it highlights a consistent underlying pattern of mobility.
A background rhythm to their lives, almost?
Kind of. And what's more, the distances these composers traveled for their moves roughly doubled every 100 years.
Whoa. Reflecting better transport, maybe. Easier communication.
Precisely. Reflecting broader advancements in transportation and communication. It gives us this statistical fingerprint of composer mobility across centuries.
That's fascinating. And did the data show where they were heading?
It did. The study identified major cities like Vienna, Paris, and Leipzig as the most popular destinations for composers, particularly at that crucial age of 20.
The big hubs.
The big hubs. These cities served as proxies for important study locations and musical centers, drawing aspiring musicians from all over. And looking at the bigger picture, statistically, certain regions became net exporters of composers, meaning more composers left them than arrived.
Like Italy. We often think of Italy importing musicians later on.
Well, in certain periods, Italy and also the Benelux region, that's Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, were statistically net exporters. Conversely, North America and France were significant net importers, attracting talent from elsewhere. It paints this vibrant, dynamic picture of cultural exchange and the flow of musical talent across geographic boundaries, all revealed by the numbers.
It's not just where composers moved, though. You mentioned earlier that even identifying them in the historical record is a challenge. Tell us more about that.
Right, the Biographical Dictionary's case study found that variant names are a surprisingly significant problem for historical research. It's not trivial.
How significant?
The sample showed around 1.5 surnames per composer on average. But get this. For composers born before 1800 who spoke French, German, Italian, Russian, or various Eastern European languages, over 40% had variant surnames documented.
40%?
Yes, leading to about 175 names for every 100 actual individuals.
That's chaos for researchers. Imagine trying to accurately track someone's contributions through history when their name might appear in multiple, slightly different spellings or transliterations.
Exactly. It makes reliable tracking and consistent data collection incredibly challenging. You can easily undercount someone's works or misattribute things. It's a fundamental data quality issue.
And what about what these composers actually did for a living? Were they all just composing full-time?
Not at all, or at least not solely. The composer occupation study found that only a quarter, just 25% of the sampled composers, were solely listed as composer.
Only a quarter. So what else were they doing?
About half, a full 50%, were also performers, singers, or instrumentalists. Portfolio careers, essentially.
Makes sense. Play it to pay the bills while you compose.
Perhaps. Furthermore, the proportion of conductors and teachers among composers significantly increased over time. It went from a mere 6% for pre-1800 composers up to around 30% after 1800.
A big jump. Reflecting changes in the music world. Rise of orchestras, music education.
Precisely. It reflects the changing nature of the musical profession itself, moving from maybe a more singular focus on composition for patrons towards a more diversified set of roles within the broader musical ecosystem.
This all ties into composer productivity too, doesn't it? The Pazurek case study you mentioned earlier.
Yes, that one revealed something fascinating about published works per composer. It showed a zip-like distribution.
Zip-like? Okay, another statistical term. What does that mean in simple terms?
Okay, think of it like this. A zip distribution is a pattern where if you rank items by frequency, the second most frequent item is about half as frequent as the first, the third is about a third as frequent, and so on. A steep drop-off.
Like word frequency in a language, the odd is super common, most words are rare.
Exactly that principle. In music publishing, this meant that a large number of composers had very few works in print. Over a third had just one published work in this dataset. 80% had fewer than 10.
Wow, 80% had fewer than 10 published works.
Meanwhile, a tiny minority of extremely prolific composers, the Bachs, the Mozarts, the Haydns, accounted for the vast majority of all published works in the catalog studied.
So it's not just an interesting statistical quirk. It profoundly explains why we know a few names so incredibly well, while thousands upon thousands of other composers who were also active and published have simply faded into obscurity.
It really challenges our perception of what greatness even means, doesn't it? Is it sheer output? Is it lasting influence? The data shows the output distribution is incredibly skewed.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly from the composers to the works themselves. What did the stats tell us about the life cycle of a musical piece? Does everything last?
Far from it. The class of 1837 case study, which meticulously examined solo piano works published just in that 1 year, suggested a startling fact. Over half of published works are never republished.
Over half? Just gone.
Essentially, think about that. Most of what was printed, performed, and perhaps even loved in its time was effectively a one-hit wonder in publishing terms, never seeing the light of day again in a later edition.
That speaks volumes about the ephemeral nature of most published music and the sheer volume of musical activity that is simply lost to time.
Wow. And it highlights the enormous importance of location and context. Being first published in a major musical center, like Leipzig, was found to be an important factor for a work's long-term success.
So where you got published mattered a lot.
The statistics suggest it did. The geographical origin of its first publication had a tangible impact on a work's survival and continued relevance. It seems like the musical equivalent of being in the right place at the right time, or maybe being part of the right influential network.
Location, 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 even in music history.
It seems so. And the Pazdurek study had another stark finding related to this disappearance. It estimated that approximately half of the works and a quarter of the composers in its huge data set had essentially disappeared from view when compared to later 20th century sources.
Just vanished from reference works?
Vanished from the main reference points.
Right.
They created a findability index, which was really interesting. It showed that British composers, for instance, were found 50% more easily than the average in later sources.
Okay.
But American, Dutch, and Scandinavian composers were about 4 times harder to find.
4 times? That's a huge difference. Is that about quality? Or just how history gets written and archived?
The data suggests it's much more about how historical information is preserved, disseminated, and perpetuated across different cultures and academic traditions, rather than an objective measure of musical quality. National biases, perhaps, or just stronger archival traditions in some places.
Yet there's a fascinating paradox emerging more recently, isn't there, with recordings?
Absolutely. In the last 2 decades, maybe a bit more, there's been an enormous increase in the availability of recordings of lesser-known works and of works by a range of obscure composers.
The digital age effect, niche labels.
All of that, driven by technological advancements, easier distribution, and renewed scholarly and performer interest in exploring beyond the canon. This recording boom has brought countless forgotten pieces right to our ears.
Yeah, you can find almost anything online now.
It's incredible. And this explosion of rediscovered music has even forced established record guides, like the Venerable Penguin guides, to become much more selective, simply because they can't possibly cover everything anymore. It's a fascinating tension between historical scarcity and modern abundance.
Is there a difference between what gets performed live and what gets published or recorded? Do programmers and labels take different risks?
That's another subtle but significant difference that statistical analysis can reveal. Concert programmers, for instance, they tend to stick with well-known composers for their main repertoire. That makes sense. They need to sell tickets.
Rely on the big names.
Right. But they might explore those composers' lesser-known works. So maybe a less famous Beethoven symphony, but still Beethoven.
Okay. And publishers or record labels?
Publishers, on the other hand, seem statistically somewhat more willing to experiment with lesser-known composers, perhaps seeking out novelties or filling gaps in the market, while still, of course, focusing heavily on the major works of the bigger names for commercial success.
So, different strategies for balancing artistic merit, public demand, and economic viability within the music ecosystem.
Interesting. It suggests different risk appetites and market pressures.
And this all culminates in a rather stark statistical finding about the persistence of fame, or maybe the persistence of obscurity.
Yes, the analysis suggests that a composer's fame or obscurity is often determined early on and is maintained for long periods.
Really? It gets set early.
The data points that way. And this isn't necessarily about objective artistic merit changing over time. It seems to be largely because compilers of historical datasets, bibliographies, dictionaries, encyclopedias heavily rely on previous sources.
Ah, the echo chamber again.
Exactly. So if a composer wasn't highlighted in earlier foundational historical accounts, it becomes an incredibly uphill battle for them to gain recognition later, regardless of the quality of their music discovered subsequently. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that dictates who we remember and who we forget.
That's quite sobering, actually. Okay, let's shift gears again slightly. What about the evolution of musical style itself? Can stats tell us about keys and meters changing over time?
Yes, they can reveal some fascinating trends there, too. The McDonald case study, for example, used quantitative methods and revealed a significant move towards flat key signatures during the first half of the 19th century.
More flats. Why?
Well, the speculation is it might be related to the increasing prominence and technical capabilities of instruments like clarinets and horns, which often favor flat keys due to their construction and valve systems.
Instrument technology driving style.
Potentially, yes. And intriguingly, the data also showed that keyboard works were consistently more likely to be written in sharp keys than non-keyboard works in every period analyzed before the 20th century.
Keyboard music leans sharp, other music leans flat in the 19th C. Why the difference?
That's a great question. It raises points about instrumental design, keyboard layouts versus wind-string instruments, perhaps established performance practices, or even different aesthetic preferences tied to the different sonic palettes of keyboards versus other ensembles.
And that leads to what Gustar calls the piano keys mystery, right?
Exactly. This case study specifically investigated why well-known keyboard works tend to be in sharper keys than more obscure ones. And the statistical difference observed was notable well-known works averaged about 1.14 sharps more than lesser-known ones.
Okay, that's specific. Is it just random chance?
Apparently not. The difference wasn't random. It was statistically attributed to a complex interplay of several factors.
Such as?
Things like the composer's age, with middle-aged composers tending to write sharper, better-known works, interestingly. Also, the work's domestic status, meaning it was perhaps intended more for home performance rather than the public concert hall. The composer's overall canonic status played a role, and perhaps most interestingly for modern times, whether the work had been recorded was also correlated.
Wow. So it's not just about pure music theory, it's about how social factors, economic factors, performance context, and even later recording history subtly shape musical aesthetics and legacy.
It seems to be a really complex web of influences. And similarly, the analysis showed that even within pieces, mid-movement key changes, particularly in minor keys and in keyboard works, also tended to move in a sharp direction, suggesting a consistent directional preference within modulations during certain periods.
Fascinating details. Now, what about time signatures? Did music get rhythmically more complex?
Well, that MacDonald study again.
No.
A major qualitative claim made by MacDonald was that complex time signatures became significantly more prevalent in the 19th century. That was the accepted wisdom.
Okay, sounds plausible. More romantic expression, maybe.
Plausible, yes.
Yeah.
But the quantitative data largely unsupported that claim.
Really? Debunked.
Pretty much. The perceived increase in complex meters was mainly due to the overall growth in the total number of musical works being composed and published during that period. So yes, there were more pieces with complex meters, but not necessarily a higher proportion of them.
It was the sheer volume increase, not a stylistic shift in complexity itself.
Exactly. Actual metrical complexity, proportionally speaking, only began to increase significantly much later, really after 1875 and into the early 20th century. This is a prime example of quantitative data directly challenging, even debunking, a qualitative assumption that had been widely accepted in musicology.
That really shows the power of checking assumptions with data.
It certainly does.
Now, this deep dive into quantitative methods has definitely illuminated their power, but it also raises an important question, doesn't it? Applying statistics isn't always straightforward, especially with messy historical music data. The past isn't always neatly packaged for analysis.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely not without its significant challenges.
So what are some of the big hurdles researchers face?
Well, one key difficulty right at the foundational level is simply defining what constitutes a musical work. It sounds simple, but it's far from it.
How so? Isn't it just the piece?
Well, think about it. A work can exist in countless forms. It can be a piece of sheet music, right?
Right.
Or a specific recording, or a live performance that's never formally documented, or even, a popular ringtone today derived from an older piece.
Okay, yeah.
And within those forms, it can appear in many guises, different arrangements, cover versions by other artists, highly personalized improvisations based on a theme. So what is the essential work when it's constantly being reinterpreted, adapted, and experienced in so many different ways?
That makes consistent classification for statistical purposes incredibly complex. What are you actually counting?
Exactly. What are you counting? And adding to that complexity, statistical analysis demands a clear differentiation between the raw corpus data, which is the specific detailed information found within a particular catalog or archive, like every single entry in a publisher's ledger, and population data, which refers to the broader insights derived from analyzing the dataset structure as a whole.
Like the number of works per composer or the distribution of key signatures across an entire era?
Precisely. You have to be very clear about what you're actually measuring and what conclusions you can legitimately draw from it. You can't conflate the two.
Beyond these definitional challenges, I imagine there are just plain data quality issues in old records.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Historical data sets are notoriously prone to, well, messiness. Typographical errors are common. Uncertain date estimates. Was it composed in 1750 or 1755? Sometimes we just don't know precisely. And frustrating duplicate records, where the same work or composer appears multiple times under slightly different entries or spellings. We talked about the name variants. That's a huge source of duplication issues.
And there's that inherent asymmetry of information you mentioned earlier, too.
Yes, that's a big one. It's simply far easier to find abundant, well-documented information about famous composers and their widely performed works than it is to dig up consistent details about their obscure counterparts. Their lives and works just weren't documented as thoroughly.
Which makes consistent treatment across a statistical sample incredibly difficult to achieve, I'd guess. How do you compare data quality for Mozart versus, say, Peruchona?
It's very hard. And this asymmetry then naturally feeds into potential sampling biases. The very process of selecting a subset of data for analysis can inadvertently over- or underrepresent certain types of works or composers.
How does that happen?
Well, a common example Gustar discusses is length bias in biographical dictionaries or catalogs. If a researcher selects entries based on, say, having a minimum amount of detail, they might inadvertently pick more famous composers simply because their entries are longer and more detailed. This would skew the sample towards the well-known, even if that wasn't the intention.
So the sampling method itself can introduce bias.
It absolutely can, if you're not careful. And then there are just the practical hurdles of data collection. A lot of historical data exists in really difficult-to-access formats. It might be locked away in dense prose within dusty old books, requiring painstaking manual extraction word by word.
Labor-intensive.
Hugely. Or it might be hidden in what Gustar calls black box online databases. These often have limited search or sampling functions, meaning you can only retrieve what the database designers allow you to see, not necessarily what you need for a comprehensive statistical analysis. You can't easily download the whole dataset, for example.
So you can't design your own sample properly. That makes the data collection process incredibly laborious, often requiring years of dedicated effort before any meaningful analysis can even begin. It's not just a matter of running a quick computer query.
Definitely not. It's often a significant undertaking. But researchers aren't just throwing up their hands. They employ several sophisticated strategies to mitigate these manifold issues.
Like what? How do you deal with all that messiness?
Well, triangulation is absolutely essential. That means cross-referencing information across multiple independent sources, different dictionaries, archives, catalogs to verify details, catch errors, and fill in gaps.
Comparing notes, basically.
Exactly. They also use careful sample design, truly random sampling if possible, or stratified sampling where you ensure different categories like time periods or nationalities are proportionally represented to ensure that the chosen subset accurately reflects the larger historical population as much as possible.
Trying to avoid those biases we talked about.
Yes. And finally, meticulous data cleaning is crucial. This involves systematically identifying and correcting errors, resolving duplicate entries, standardizing formats for things like dates or names. It's often tedious work.
Sounds like digital housekeeping on a massive scale.
It kind of is. But it's absolutely vital to minimize these issues and, most importantly, to improve confidence in the final results. It's a testament to the rigorous, often painstaking work involved in this quantitative approach, but it's what allows us to truly build a more reliable picture of music history, warts and all.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not magic, it's hard work. Now, we've talked a lot about the data, the composers, the works, but beyond the raw numbers and historical trends, a really compelling question emerges. How did the music of composers like Leonarda and Peruchona actually sound in their time?
Performance practice, yes.
What was it like to experience their work live, maybe in the setting of a 17th century convent or church? This moves us beyond the data points to the living, breathing art itself.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is that the modern concept we have of fidelity to a score, where a performer aims to execute every single note and dynamic marking precisely as the composer wrote it down.
Yeah, playing exactly what's on the page.
That idea simply didn't exist in the same way 400 years ago. Baroque performance actively embraced what we now call performative freedom. It wasn't just allowed. It was generally expected that performers would improvise, add embellishments, maybe even alter rhythms or tempos.
So the score was more like a guideline.
Exactly. More of a framework, a blueprint, rather than a rigid set of instructions. It was a living, breathing art form, constantly in flux with each performance and performer.
So improvisation and embellishment weren't just optional extras. They were absolutely central to the cultural context of Baroque music.
Very much so. Performers were expected to understand their own culture's musical practices as a kind of default music treatment. They knew the conventions. For example, singers would often improvise counterpoint, a secondary melody, over a cantus firmus, which is a fixed, pre-existing melody that served as a foundation.
So they were active co-creators in the musical moment, not just passive interpreters of the score.
Absolutely. They brought their own skill and artistry to bear in shaping the final sound. This meant every performance was, to a degree, unique. You wouldn't necessarily hear the exact same piece twice.
Was it a complete free-for-all, though? Or did composers have opinions?
Oh, composers definitely had their preferences.
Yeah.
It wasn't total anarchy. Figures like Giovanni Maria Bononcini and Giovanni Paolo Cima, for instance, sometimes included notes in their prefaces, basically pleading with singers not to alter the music poorly.
Don't mess it up too badly.
Pretty much. Suggesting that maybe ornaments should be limited to specific, tasteful additions, like a gaiety, little accents or stresses, and trilli, or trills. This indicates a nuanced approach to artistic freedom, a kind of negotiation between expressive liberty and compositional intent.
And even things like trills weren't static, right? They changed.
That's right. We see evidence of different types of trills evolving over time. Early Baroque trills were often more like rapid repetitions of the same note, contrasting with the later, more familiar trills that alternate between two adjacent notes. This highlights the constant evolution even within the very details of performance practice.
And the emotional expression, the effetto, that was paramount, wasn't it?
Absolutely central. Baroque music heavily emphasized conveying strong emotional effects, the passions, the joys, the sorrows, religious fervor. Composers and performers aimed to move the listener deeply, to stir their souls.
How does that translate to modern performance?
Well, the study on Leonarda suggests that for modern audiences, maybe a degree of necessary exaggeration may be more effective in conveying effetto.
Why exaggerate?
Because our modern ears no longer instinctively translate the subtle expressive cues and rhetorical gestures that a Baroque audience would have immediately understood. We've lost some of that shared cultural language. So a performer today might need to be a bit bolder with dynamics or tempo flexibility rubato to bridge that historical gap and truly convey the intended emotional weight. It's about making the music speak powerfully across centuries.
That makes sense. What about other practical aspects like transposition or vocal sound?
Those also played a significant part in the unique sound world of the Baroque era. The use of high clefs, known technically as chiavette, in scores often implied the need for transposition.
High clefs meant transposed down.
Generally, yes, especially for vocal music. These weren't just a quirk of notation, they were often a deliberate signal to performers. They effectively told singers, this music is written higher than it's likely meant to be sung by your voice type in this context, so you probably need to transpose it down to a more comfortable range.
So the written pitch wasn't absolute.
Not always, no. And female composers like Claudia Rusca even included explicit instructions in their publications on how to restore the music for treble choir from the printed mixed choir version. Perhaps the version published for wider use by transposing the tenor or bass lines up an octave.
Wow, specific instructions on how to adapt it.
Yes. This reveals a truly authentic performance practice for the time, demonstrating that the written score was often considered adaptable to the specific performing forces and the desired overall sound.
And what was the desired sound itself, particularly in choral settings like convents or churches? Was it small and intimate?
Not necessarily, especially in larger institutions. Historical accounts indicate a strong desire for a large magnitude of sound in choral singing in many places. For instance, the Venerable Duomo, the cathedral in Milan, often fielded choirs of 17 to 25 singers.
17 to 25 singers, that's not delicate chamber music.
No, it was intended to fill vast sacred spaces with a powerful, resonant sound. It definitely challenges any modern assumption that all early music was performed with small, hushed ensembles.
And what about the female choirs, like those in the Venetian Ospedali? They were famous, weren't they?
Highly famous and highly praised throughout Europe. They were celebrated for their ability to soar without fear into the high register, achieving an effortless virtuosity. But also, interestingly, these choirs were lauded for possessing voices that could be described with terms like natural, masculine, full, baritone, and tender.
Masculine, baritone, for female voices.
It's remarkable terminology, isn't it? It suggests an appreciation for a really wide range of timbres and vocal qualities, perhaps including strong lower registers, that challenges many modern assumptions about what female voices could or should sound like in historical contexts. It points to an appreciation for vocal power and diversity that we might not immediately associate with the period.
We even have insights into the expected etiquette of singing back then.
We do. From 17th century commentators like Pietro del Valle, his comments offer a fascinating window into desired singing behavior. He advised singers against using excessive ornamentation just for showiness.
Tasteful embellishment, not flashy.
Exactly. He emphasized performing emotions in line with the text, making sure the musical expression always served the meaning of the lyrics. And he also mentioned maintaining professional posture and expression while singing. These little details paint a vivid picture of the decorum and the artistic standards expected of performers at the time.
So bringing it back to our composers, how did Isabella Leonarda and Maria Xaveria Peruchona, within their specific convent context, navigate and contribute to this evolving sound world? Can we hear it in Leonarda's music?
We certainly can try to infer it. Take Leonarda's motet Domine ad adiuvandum, for example, which is analyzed in the second study. It beautifully showcases a fanfare-like chordal style, creating this immediate sense of grandeur and joyous acclamation right from the start.
Big opening.
Big opening. And she achieves what the author describes as a kaleidoscopic, vibrant, quasi-perpetuum mobile sonority. Almost a perpetual motion of sound through ingenious compositional techniques. Things like textural crescendo and imitation, where voices enter one after another, building intensity layer by layer, and through the use of rapid, energetic, rhythmic trills, especially in sections like the final Amen.
So it sounds exciting, vibrant.
Exactly. It paints a vivid picture of a composer skillfully utilizing the stylistic tools of her era to create music that was both technically adept, exciting to listen to, and deeply expressive within its intended sacred context.
It's a powerful, vibrant sound you're describing, yet there's that profound paradox of invisibility surrounding these nun composers that you mentioned earlier.
Yes, it's a crucial point. Despite their often public performances within the convents, nuns were typically expected to be, well, muted in broader society. Their voices weren't meant to carry the same public weight as men's.
And this was influenced by religious interpretations.
Heavily influenced by interpretations of biblical passages like 1 Corinthians 14.34, which famously states, Muliae tacit in ecclesia, women should be silent in the church. Now, the interpretation and application varied, as we saw, but the sentiment was pervasive.
So while they created and performed this extraordinary music, their individual identities as artists were often deliberately downplayed or subsumed within the collective spiritual purpose of the convent.
That seems to be the case. For these nuns, musical practice itself often became a deeply spiritual and intensely personal experience. The source suggests thinking of it almost as a form of daily martyrdom.
Daily martyrdom, how so?
It was a way of transforming their physical confinement, their enclosure, and their perceived lack of external worldly freedom into a profound spiritual freedom within the convent walls. Music became a vehicle for transcendence. And this invisibility of performers wasn't necessarily seen as a flaw at the time. It meant the music's impact was deeply tied to the audience's perception of spiritual ecstasies, of divine rapture being channeled, rather than focusing on the individual musician's virtuosity or fame. The focus was intended to be on the transcendent power of the music and the spiritual devotion it embodied.
Making their contribution both immense and, by design, often anonymous to the outside world. That's a powerful thought.
It really is. It adds another layer to understanding their legacy.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed through these rich, sometimes really contradictory layers of music history. We began by understanding that pervasive great man bias that has historically shaped traditional narratives, often silencing countless voices and obscuring the true breadth of musical activity.
Getting stuck on the peaks and missing the valleys and plains.
Exactly. Then we shifted our perspective, exploring how rigorous statistical analysis can, quantify existing knowledge, reveal those inherent biases within the historical record itself, and uncover vast, previously lost historical trends.
Things like the true productivity distribution of composers, that zip curve, or the hidden migration patterns of musicians, or the subtle evolution of musical style, like key signatures over centuries. Things you just can't see easily without the big data picture.
We specifically highlighted figures like Isabella Leonarda and Maria Xaveria Peruchona. Though confined within convent walls, they harnessed their creativity to leave a significant, albeit often overlooked, musical legacy.
And their music implicitly carried performance traditions vastly different from our modern expectations of fidelity to the score. They embraced improvisation, transposition, and created a unique communal sound world tailored to their specific circumstances.
And why does all this matter so much to you, the listener? Well, because gaining a full, nuanced understanding of history isn't just about celebrating a few famous names and their certified masterpieces.
Oh, that's important too.
Of course. But it's also about appreciating the entire complex tapestry of human creativity and activity in all its messy, diverse, and often hidden glory. Quantitative methods offer this invaluable, often really eye-opening tool to quantify and contextualize existing information. They give a collective voice to that vast majority of musical activity that has historically been ignored or simply couldn't be seen clearly through traditional narrative lenses alone.
So maybe we can leave you with a provocative thought to mull over. Consider this. If historical sources themselves are inherently biased, reflecting the perspectives and priorities of those who created and preserved them.
Which seems likely.
And if our current understanding of music history largely reflects these ingrained biases, perpetuated through generations of scholarship relying on those same biased sources, what entirely new narratives might emerge? What revelations might be waiting if we were to rigorously apply statistical analysis to all available historical data?
Not just the important stuff in major archives.
Exactly. Not just what had survived in prominent archives and been deemed important, but also digging into what has been overlooked precisely because of its very obscurity, mining the less obvious sources.
And how might this fundamentally change our collective perception of greatness in music? Might it prompt us to look beyond the established canon, beyond the familiar peaks, and appreciate the full, magnificent symphony of human musical expression across the ages in all its statistical richness and human variety?
What other stories are waiting in the data?
Something to ponder as you listen to your favorite pieces, and perhaps seek out and discover some new, maybe previously unheard ones.